I spent several years on this quest to find home. I just want to know where I'm supposed to be, as though there was this architected, preordained plan for me and my life and this path of destiny. I was so scared that I was somehow going to miss the path. Michelle the Medium says you are looking outside of yourself for the feeling that ultimately exists within you. This is the next hurdle for you to really enter into a family of your own. Belonging is not about finding your tribe. It's not even about finding the friends that feel like family. It really is this quest of being so clear on who you are within yourself. And so then we can truly grasp and hold that paradox of I belong nowhere, I belong everywhere, but I belong to me. Hello and welcome back. Today we have quite a big, meaty topic up for discussion. I've been contemplating this topic for the entirety of 2024, which insofar has been about 4 months. Lots of deep contemplation. I have read books, I have been in experiment, I have been journaling, and today we get to conclude this quest. We're going to dive into the concept of true, authentic belonging in today's episode. I shared just around New Year's that I was going to go back to Australia, my home country, for the first time in almost 5 years. I left Australia in August of 2019. I came back for about 6 days to visit in January of 2020, and I had not been back since. What began as a restriction of travel due to the pandemic then became an avoidance. At the same time, I realized that I had spent several years on this quest to find home. And I always had this unsettling feeling of, I'm not quite sure though. I don't really feel like I truly know if I'm ready to settle down, or I don't know if this is really it, or is that really home? And I had these very conflicting feelings for quite a while, where I was just I just want to know where I'm supposed to be, as though there was this architected, preordained plan for me and my life and this kind of, path of destiny. And I just kind of had this very unsettled feeling, maybe I was getting it wrong, or I was nervous that I was getting it wrong. I was so scared that I was somehow going to miss the path. And I was just I just don't want to make a mistake, what if I miss something? What if I take a wrong turn? And it's so funny how I just got to really convincing myself that that was somehow the correct paradigm. I was either right or I was wrong, and I was either going to be on the right road or I was going to miss the turn off. One of my friends, Zoe, who you might have heard me talk about in previous episodes, would often speak to me about her psychic, Michelle the Medium. Domain literally just michellethemedium.com. What a great brand name, Michelle the Medium. And, Zoe sees Michelle twice a year, every 6 months. And Michelle just has this thing where she will just channel for you, and she will just go. And she'll just start channeling. And, I have had a little bit of an addiction to psychics, which I have now weaned off. I'm okay, I'm off psychics. No more of that for me. It's they're crack for me. I don't know. Just I've had this real addiction to it. It's so funny. But I'm done now. I'm truly done. No more. I got to this point in my own journey of frustration and friction where I was you know what? I think I'm just going to talk to Michelle the Medium. And the thing with Michelle is that she has this really long wait list. And whenever I would look up her website, the wait would be anywhere from 3 to 4 months, sometimes even longer. And I would just be I don't have this kind of time to wait around. I need this now. I want answers now. And so I'd been aware of her for years, and I just never booked in because of the time thing. And at the end of last year in December, I was starting to get really antsy and frustrated and, restless. Me with my token restlessness. And after looking at her bookings and seeing that time frame of waiting, I was like, no, I'm not doing this. But then my intuition perked up and it was like, check again. And I was like, okay, intuition, you're so smart, So I go and check again and she has an opening in 3 weeks. And it was like, whoa, that's so unusual. That's never happened. And I was like, okay, it's a sign. I better book in. So I lock the appointment in. And I've never had a session with her before. This was my first one after 2 years of hearing all about her. We have this consult over Skype. There's no video, there's no form, there's no questions. You just jump on a Skype phone call and she's like, okay, this is how I work. Do you have any questions? And I'll be like, yes. And she's like, all right, don't ask me though. Just have them in the back of your mind. And she's like, and then by the end of the session, I'm going to give you like 10 minutes. And if I haven't answered all of your questions by the end, then you can ask them and then we can do that. Does that sound good? And I'm like, okay, this is interesting. So this woman can't see me. She doesn't know who I am. She hasn't looked me up. She's just channeling, right? Off the bat, the first thing that she says is like, you've been moving around for quite some time. And I was like, yes, I have. Yeah, like for 4.5 years. Yeah, I've been moving around. And she's like, yeah, you don't live like where you've come from. And I was like, no, I don't. She's like, yeah. She's like, you're looking for something. And I was like, yeah, I'm totally looking for something. And she's like, right. She's like, there's this deep sadness within you. And I was like, what? No, I don't know. I'm pretty good. I don't know. And she just kind of keeps going and ultimately, lands on this point of like, you don't really feel like you belong anywhere. And deep down, there's this restlessness and there's this feeling of like, I don't belong. And you are looking outside of yourself for home. You're looking for somewhere to belong in the external world. But ultimately, you've been running your whole life from your actual home. And you've been avoiding and resisting. And it's time now for you to complete this journey of searching in the external world for the feeling that ultimately exists within you, which I know that you already know conceptually. She's like, but you now need to do the work, and that requires you to go home and deal with your family stuff. And she kind of articulated some very specific things about my mother and my relationship with my family and my experience growing up as a child and a teenager. And I was like, okay, that's all very, very specific. That's not a generalization anymore. She's talking about like my experience in school and as an only child and, that I don't have a father. And I was like, okay, look, lady, you know some things. And she's like, yeah, you're going to have to just go back home and deal with these things and reconcile and integrate these things. She's like, you ultimately will feel more at peace within yourself. But this is kind of like a really major thing for you on your journey. And it's sort of like, you've done so much work on yourself and you've done so much inner work. And this is going to be like one of your last major kind of integration pieces for your soul's actualization. Like, you've done all this stuff on like self-acceptance and self-love and like deconditioning this and that and success and whatever. And she's like, but now there's this family piece. And ultimately, this is, like the next hurdle for you to really enter into a family of your own, for you to feel that sense of like grounded belonging and home wherever you are. And I was like, wow, yeah, cool. Makes sense. Like for some time now, I've been outwardly saying like, oh yeah, I feel like I'm ready for a partner and I feel like I'm looking for a life partner and, a romantic thing and that would be cool. And I'm ready for that. And I feel like I'm open to commitment, bloody blah. But then at the same time, I'd also feel this resistance, right? And I had this kind of realization, I don't know, maybe a year ago where I was like, oh, how can I find a life partner when I'm just like constantly moving? That literally makes no sense. Like I need to like pick a place. And so that's where this kind of conflict came in, because I was like, where is the right place? And what if I'm, so there was this connection in my mind between, I think I'm ready to like have a relationship, but I also feel like I want to keep moving. And these two things don't really make sense. And for a long time, I was just like, well, I would just find a nomadic person, but the reality is that there was something that was unintegrated. I'm not going to say like you need to be in one place to find a partner because that's not fundamentally true, but there was something in me that was just fundamentally unintegrated. And so, what Michelle was picking up on was that integration piece, and she was reflecting and mirroring that back to me, and she was just like, you gotta go home, like you gotta. And I could feel for some time this bubbling resistance within me, and I was like, yeah, I feel like I don't want to, which means I probably should. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna just cancel all my plans for 2024, forget about whatever I thought I was going to do, forget about whatever, all of it in my mind. It's just stories. It doesn't matter. The most important thing to me right now is like working on my health, which I was aware I had some health stuff, and then really integrating this like deep, deep, deep layer of the onion that, is probably like one of my last layers. And, like I think life is just like an ongoing healing and integration journey. I don't think I'm done, but I do feel like this is like a very bottom layer that is specifically a hurdle in regards to that like life partner piece, or in regards to that like feeling grounded piece of just feeling really settled. And like obviously life is a continual thing, so I don't want create any misconceptions there. So then I made my declaration. I was like, okay, I'm going back to Australia. I'm going to spend time there. I'm not going to just visit for a week. I'm going to really spend some time in Australia, and I'm going to reconcile my relationship with this country, with this culture. I'm going to really get in there with my mum. I'm going to figure some stuff out. And so, I shared this, and I received a lot of engagement and feedback on this post where I talked about belonging. People were like, wow, I'm really resonating with this. And like, yeah, I don't feel like I belong. And, people have their different shades of this, right? Whether it's like, I don't feel like I belong in my family, or I don't feel like I belong in my country, or I don't feel like I belong in this city, or I struggle to feel like I belong in general. Like I don't even know where to exist. And so what we're going to break down today is this whole journey. It's this quest for the feeling of home. It's the paradox of belonging. And it's just perfect timing, because as I record this, I am leaving Australia. So I've been here for 2 months already, which is crazy. I can't believe it's been 2 months. I'm leaving in 3 days, 72 hours. I'll be on a plane heading over to Europe for the summer, continuing on with my adventures and miscellaneous travels. But I literally just had the epiphany yesterday. So I can't believe that I'm recording this today. After 2 months of kind of like waiting for this like big climactic moment, thinking that like, when is this penny going to drop? Ironically, it drops within 24 hours of this recording. So this is very salient. So growing up in Melbourne, Australia, as a child of 2 different immigrants, my mother is Chinese, my dad is German. They both migrated to Australia in their 30s. Both of them could not speak English. They had to learn it. It was their second language. Then me as a first generation Australian, like I have my own intricacies of experiences. Like I always had this feeling growing up in this culture that I was different to the white kids, or I was different to the very Australian kids that would maybe be like second or third generation Australian. I was never someone that liked sport, particularly Australian sport. I wasn't a particularly athletic child. I had this very strong culture from my mum's side that really dictated a lot of my viewpoints and my way of seeing the world, and my values of what I thought was important, the injected externalized values. Because, Asian culture, and particularly Chinese culture, which is very, very strong, and my mum is a very dominant alpha woman with a lot of opinions and a lot of strong thoughts, it was just very, very present. It wasn't like I had no culture and I was just this kind of like, blank board, easy for people to kind of be like, oh, hey, like, why don't you just like this? And why don't you, think this? It would be like, no, these are my thoughts, and these are my beliefs, and these are my opinions. And, this comes from a very strong mother, and it's a very strong culture, and this lineage, it's going back thousands and thousands of years. And we've been around for a very long time, And so what's interesting now is that like after a long time, I've actually arrived at after kind of absorbing a lot of these traditions and then rebelling and kind of going the other way, I've now arrived at a point where I'm like, man, Eastern philosophy is great. Eastern medicine's great. And I'm like, oh, it's so funny. Like these people like actually really knew what they were doing this whole time. And a lot of what I've ended up arriving at hasn't come from my mum. It's come from my own inquiry that I've gone out and forged in the world. But I've actually arrived at a very similar place through, I don't know, chance. But growing up, I just often felt like I did not fit in. I often felt like I was the odd one out. I often felt like I was never fully embraced into any particular social group. I grew up in an area that was very dominated by refugees, dominated by immigrants, people of particular cultures. And actually, funnily enough, Caucasians were the minority. And so just kind of, I was this like mixed race child that was sort of like, not really one of us, not really one of them. And then when I went to high school, I went to a very white, Caucasian dominated, upper class, more middle upper class private school that I got a scholarship to. And, the culture of that school was very, very sporty, very second, third generation Australians that had a lot of money by the beach. People were very sporty. And I just didn't quite feel like I fit in with the white kids, the sporty kids, the popular kids. Then there were a few Asian scholarship kids, and I was kind of like, I don't really fit in there either, but I fit in more there. And so I kind of had this weird thing of this double identity that was very present throughout most of my adolescence. As I was forming my sense of self, I kind of felt like I had two identities. So I kind of often felt like at school, I had this almost persona where I was fitting in with more the nerdy kids and the scholarship kids and the Asians who never fully adopted me because I wasn't fully one of them. But they were like, you can kind of sit with us, but we know that you're a little bit different. And then I'd have this alter ego, outside of school where I was just this real rebel, kind of wildcat. And I was just doing all kinds of crazy shit. So there was these two things, right? And, it's interesting now kind of knowing a sense of astrology and being oh, I'm a Gemini moon, I have these two personas and I have these multiple archetypes that exist within me. And I, have this very layered sense of identity. But ultimately there was always this sense of I'm not quite this and I'm not quite that. And I don't really know where I belong. And a lot of that was cultural. Then, there was always this feeling of I don't also feel like I fit in with my family. My mom has these very strong cultural beliefs that feel very at odds with the culture of this country, which is more progressive and very Western. And, she has these expectations of me that I don't really feel fit in alignment with my values and who I am and my authentic expression. And we had a lot of disagreements growing up. I think lucky for me, I did kind of, and I don't know where, this came from or how I developed this, but I did have always quite a strong backbone. And so, and it wasn't the strongest, but it was strong enough, more than others, less than some, where even though she had this idea of who she wanted me to be and how she wanted me to behave and what she wanted me to believe, I often challenged that and was well, hold on, I don't really know if that's the case. And I need to figure out who I am and I need to figure out what I like. And I don't know if I want to do that. And I'm just going to make my own decisions. And so we would regularly butt heads and disagree. And often that would lead to a lot of arguments and conflict. But I was just very firm in who I wanted to become and what I wanted to do. And I fought for that pretty ruthlessly at the expense of us having a good relationship and her approving of me and that love was very conditional. So I was I would rather just be my authentic self and I would rather fight for what I want and have you mad at me than do what you want, but then I'm mad at me. And so I was kind of always from I guess a relatively young age, I saw that as the trade-off and I was willing to tolerate and exist in that discomfort as hard as it was. So there were just these layers of I don't feel like I belong in this culture. I don't feel like I belong in this home. And that void created this intense drive to find a sense of belonging in the external world. And so when I was 19, I had saved for a year and I was I'm going to go backpacking. I was really actually on a hunt or on a quest to find where I would one day live. And so I always kind of had this feeling I would live in Europe. I always just loved the European culture, particularly arty. and just, I don't know, really resonated with it. And I always kind of thought, yeah, I'm going to live in Europe, and it's going to be, a very like creative city. Like maybe it's going to be like Florence or Barcelona, or maybe it's going to be Berlin. And so like on my first European trip as this like 19-year-old with a backpack, everywhere I went, it was with this like kind of secret agenda of like, sussing the city out, being like, could I live here? Could I live here? And just, that was always in the back of my mind of like, where am I going to live? Where am I going to live? And it was almost like I was scouting. It was like a recce scout trip of being like, okay, where am I going to move one day? Because I'm going to go back to Australia, finish my degree, save some money, and then I'm just going to get out of there because I don't belong there. And that was my agenda. And what's really interesting is like on that first trip, I was like, wow, I really feel like I belong in Berlin. I feel like that is the culture that I really resonate with. And I had this like big plan to move to Berlin. And I might have like mentioned this in a previous episode. Like one of the things that I often regretted for a very long time was that I didn't go when I was like 21, 22, because that was kind of, that was the plan. I was like, yeah, I'm going to go and like get out of here. And I never did. And sometimes I wonder like what path my life would have taken if I had have done that. I think it would be very different, radically different. I don't think I would not be standing here or sitting here today recording this episode. So, after finding a great deal of belonging in a community in Bali in 2019, and then being like, I'm restless again, I don't know if I really want to be here. I'm going to find somewhere else, right? And then kind of being on this like 2-year journey of being like, oh, is it London? Is it Dubai? Is it LA? Is it Austin? Is it Tulum? It's not here. Is it Costa Rica? And eventually kind of being like, I don't know, man. I just don't know. Then I was like, yeah, maybe the problem is me, actually. Maybe it's just me, and it's really funny because I think, I've always been such an adventurous person that has had such a fondness for travel. And whenever someone's been like, do you think you're running away from something? I've always been like, no, like I just love experiences. Like I love adventure. I love culture. And like, I think that's all true. And also I don't think it's an either or. I don't think that if you are traveling, you are necessarily running away. I think that you can love culture and genuinely be in the moment and like love the experience. And also you might have this unintegrated piece. And it was just so subtle for me, and it just wasn't ready to be looked at for such a long time. But it became really apparent to me like in the last 6 months. I was like, yeah. There's definitely something weird going on here. I can feel it. I'm aware of it. And so I set this intention. I was like, cool, let's see what's underneath the hood. And so the last 2 months has been an inquiry where I've not really done any work. I've kind of sort of been still on sabbatical, which started in like November. And I have made a very intentional attempt to catch up with people that I used to be friends with, to journal, to read certain texts, and to really reflect on this thing. So I was sort of waiting for this big climactic moment, and it didn't really come in the way that I thought it would come. But who knows? Maybe I'll feel it when I get on the plane in 3 days. What I've arrived at so far that I think is really interesting is that, one component is like the relationship to my mother, which, is like it's a whole separate thing. And it doesn't really relate to the belonging piece as much, so I'm just going to exclude that for this episode. For me, there was this personal journey of looking at these things that felt painful. And, one of those pieces was like, there was this loneliness that I felt here. This feeling of like the people that live here don't share my beliefs and my attitudes towards a lot of things. Like we don't share the same spiritual beliefs, or we don't share the same, necessarily like political ideologies, or I think a really big thing for me was I didn't feel like anyone really shared my ambition. And I always kind of felt like Australia has this like real culture of keep your head down and don't make too much noise. And so like we often refer to this as like this kind of tall poppy syndrome, where if you are a tall poppy and you start to kind of grow above the other flowers, then there's this culture of like cutting you down, and we don't want anyone to be too bright or too big above the rest of us. We want everyone to be relatively like low key, chill, have your beer at the pub, like just be a good person. Like don't try and be this like big somebody, like who are you going to be? Like don't do that. And so we cut people down if someone has like big dreams. And so because I am quite an ambitious person, I often felt very misunderstood, or I often felt kind of like shamed or like alienated that, you know, I couldn't achieve what I wanted to achieve here. And I felt very lonely in that. And I was always kind of like trying to convince other people to have dreams and, you know, just wasting a lot of energy being like, you know, you could do this or you could do that and da-da-da-da. And it's just like, you know, it's just not the culture here. But also, you know, that's okay. That's okay. And so for a long time, I really had this like contempt or resentment, like somehow like this culture was like holding me back, or like, you know, that it was just not supportive of me, and that like, you know, like I wasn't, that it was somehow a detriment. But really, the culture is just the culture, right? And your dreams are your dreams. And, you know, this is what I've realized over the last few days, that this is really integrated, which I think is really powerful. So I've got some notes here that I'm going to go into. I recently finished reading the book Braving the Wilderness by Brené Brown, which is so wild because she wrote that in like, I think 2017. And she talks a lot about political divisiveness in that book, and it's just so relevant for right now. But I mean, you know, we've obviously been politically divided for a very long time. But it is kind of crazy to think about, you know, some of the conflicts that happen. Like I've seen so many friends and just people in the industry, you know, like block, cancel, delete, like end friendships over a difference in opinion. And so like that book has never been more relevant than it is now. Brené Brown defines belonging as the innate human desire to be part of something larger than us. Because this yearning is so primal, we often try to acquire it by fitting in and by seeking approval, which are not only hollow substitutes for belonging, but often barriers to it. Because true belonging only happens when we present our authentic, imperfect selves to the world. Our sense of belonging can never be greater than our level of self-acceptance. She says that true belonging isn't something that we can achieve with others, that it's something that we carry in our heart. And that we often look to the ideology of a culture to connect with other people. But when we do this, we forget that we're actually connected by something far greater than ideology. We are connected by love and the triumph of the human spirit. You know, like the very nature of our existence is interconnectedness. You know, we are all part of the same fabric. We're all part of the same universe. And we do forget that. We look at these commonalities in order to connect, and we think that those commonalities are essential to connect. But, you know, the foundational core of it is that we're human and we're alive. Like you could go up to someone, and rather than being like, oh, you're a liberal, I'm a liberal, or rather than being like, oh, like, you know, you have this ambition, I have this ambition, you know, you could kind of just go up to someone and be like, oh my God, you're alive and I'm alive and we're sharing the same fundamental human experience. Whoa. Because ultimately that's what it is, right? It's like we're bound by love and the interconnectedness of all things. Like we feel, we're human, we're alive, we're having the human experience. We all live, we all die. We all love. That's what binds us. And yet we look for these other things. And then we base our belonging on these other things, which are not actually the right threads, right? So what makes us feel like we don't belong? It is that difference in ideology. It is that difference in culture. It is that difference in philosophical, political viewpoints, religious viewpoints. It is difference in morality, difference in values. And, you know, there's this misconception that if I don't hold the same viewpoints, then, you know, I don't belong in this group of people, right? This group of people all believe in, there's so many issues that pervade the world right now. Like, oh, you know, are you pro-life or are you like, what's your stance on gun control? Like, what's your stance on like, you know, these laws or like that policy, right? And then like, it just gets so divisive because people are like, well, you know, like I believe in this. And people are like, well, I believe in the opposite. And then it creates this like us versus them mentality, right? And so then it creates this divisiveness and this separation. And it's like, why are we doing this, you know? When this happens, when we have this sense of like, I don't belong here because I don't share the same viewpoint, I think what happens is like it turns on this biological safety mechanism that says like, I'm not sure it's safe for me to be here. You know, like I don't think that it's safe. What if these people turn on me? What if I'm not included? And what if they reject me? You know, we face these biological threats to our safety, and it's so inbuilt in our system, right? And then that leads us to seeking what we think is belonging, right? But it's really just false belonging. It's really just this sense of fitting in. It's actually just agreeing. What we're looking for is agreeance. We're looking for people that agree with us. And the safety of that shared viewpoint, the safety of people agreeing with our ideologies is actually just the perpetuation of echo chambers. And so then we all live in these little echo chambers in these bubbles, and we become quite narrow-minded and quite stuck in our views, rather than just being like, oh, cool, like I think this, and you can think that, and that's okay. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, the moment that we focus on that disagreement and we feel like we don't belong, we automatically look for evidence to support that. And that is confirmation bias at work. It's the innate process of filtering out everything that doesn't support what you're looking for. So this is a really critical moment because you may not realize it at this point in time, but you actually have a choice. You can choose to see the evidence that you don't belong, which your mind will automatically filter for and look for, and it will find that evidence because it's always going to be there. But you can also very consciously do the opposite, and you can find evidence that you do belong. And this is so powerful because if you allow your mind to go into the default mechanism of, I feel like I don't belong, and so I'm just going to find all these reasons why I don't belong. Yeah, see, like they disagree with me on this and they disagree with me on that, and this doesn't exist there, and see, I'm an outsider and I'm an outlier, and you know, like I'm really the minority here, and because I'm the minority here, I don't feel safe, and therefore I don't belong here, and I shouldn't be here, and I'm going to find somewhere where I do belong. You're just going to keep perpetuating that cycle over and over again, finding all of this evidence that you're not safe in the world. Think about that. And now think that like you actually have a choice in the matter. You can choose differently. You can choose to see things differently. You can absolutely choose to change your perceptions. And that's the power, right? You have the power here. So you can choose to find evidence that you do belong, and which, as we mentioned earlier, is really like, I'm alive. We're all the interconnected fabric of the same stardust, and we're all like existing in the same, you know, on the same earth. We breathe the same air. We, you know, are lit by the same sun. We're all human, you know? So yeah, of course I belong here. I belong here because I'm human, not because I share the same stance as you on gun control, right? It's like, no one is going to advocate for your belonging. It's your job to stand up and say, I belong here above all else because I'm human. Really let that sink in. Someone might advocate for your belonging. Someone might stand up and they might interject in a group dynamic and be like, hey, you should include such and such, and like they belong here and it's okay, and hey, it's safe for you to be here. They might, but it's no one's job to advocate for you. That's your job. And we've been looking at this all wrong. You know, like, it's actually our responsibility to say, I deserve to be here and I want to be here and it's okay for me to be here. I belong here because we're all the same. And I'm going to look for how we're the same rather than how we're different. Brené Brown references Maya Angelou quite a bit throughout the book, who I love. And, you know, she very famously said that you are only free when you realize that you belong no place. You belong every place, no place at all. The price is high. The reward is great. And I've been contemplating this quote for the last couple of months. This concept of the paradox of belonging, of belonging everywhere and belonging nowhere. What does that really mean? And, she really is talking about belonging to yourself. Belonging is not being a part of a particular social or cultural group. And that's what she means by belonging everywhere and nowhere. Because if you look at it from an ideological standpoint, you are actually probably never going to belong anywhere. But if you look at it from a fundamental human standpoint, you're going to belong everywhere. And so what it really comes down to is you belonging to you. Maya belongs to Maya. Phoebe belongs to Phoebe. And what that means is that your relationship with yourself should be so strong that it should have the power to override any fear or discomfort that arises when your beliefs, thoughts, or attitudes differ from those around you. So much you can always be your true self and express what matters to you. It's ultimately your ability to live in your values without compromise, knowing that they don't need to define whether you get to exist in a particular space. That's what she means by that. The feeling of not belonging is when you feel like you can't be your authentic self in a particular environment. And you can change that. You can change that by cultivating that relationship with yourself, cultivating that bravery, that courage, that strength, that resilience to be yourself at any given time, all the time, and go, yeah, I can exist differently to you. And that doesn't mean that I don't belong here, because my ability to belong here is my ability to stand firm within myself. It's my ability to hold my own convictions and go, I don't need to agree with you and you don't need to agree with me. And actually that's safe. And if I can hold that pole, I hope that you can hold that pole too. And this is a really hard thing, because it does come down to the other person to be able to hold that pole of inclusion and acceptance in difference. But ultimately, cultivating this belonging anywhere, it's a combination of skills, right? And, in addition to everything that I mentioned earlier, the bravery, courage, resilience, empathy, it also really comes down to communication skills. And so what we want to do is, to ensure that we're creating a culture of belonging in our social groups, in our families, in our workplaces, our companies, our countries. We want to use inclusive language. We want to invite people in and be like, yeah, we, it's not us versus them. You're not different. I'm not speaking to you based on your gender or your race or your whatever, right? Like your sexuality, like it's just, you're human. We're just human. We're all human. Inclusive. But I think a really big thing here, which is really interesting, is that we have this thing where we will just, often accuse people of things. And it's like we often just assume the worst. I find it so interesting. Like it's happened to me a bunch of times. And, Brené talks about an example where it happened to her. And she also talks about like a research participant who shares when it happened to him. And so ultimately, like maybe you can relate to this. Like if someone has ever just like accused you of being like sexist or racist or just discriminatory in any way, like regardless of what it's about, right? But it's been such an innocence on your behalf where you genuinely just like didn't know. This has come up for me twice. Both of them were in 2022. So at the very beginning of 2022, I shared a story about how like a hacker got into my Instagram account and I was like trying to get the account back and I was in this race against the hacker and it was all very funny and it was very comedic and it was very light. And I included in my story the race of the hacker just without thinking, like I didn't think that that was like an offensive thing to do. And a person in my audience who was of that race remarked that they were really hurt and that felt, really discriminatory. And I was like, why? My understanding of racism was so different, right? It was like a very like, I'm excluding you or I'm accepting you. And at the time, keep in mind, this was 2.5 years ago, I was so offended by the accusation of racism rather than, and that offense at the time prevented me from immediately being able to lean in and be like, oh, I'm so sorry. Like, can you explain to me why this was hurtful? Or like, I might have a blind spot here. Can you explain to me, like what it was about this particular languaging or this particular, like, why was this offensive or why did that feel racist? Like, I'm learning something about this, right? And so there was this kind of, because of the way that they had approached it, and they were just like, that's racist, rather than being like, hey, did you know? And so then I kind of shut down, because I was like, well, that accusation doesn't fit in with my picture of myself. And so I wasn't open to receiving that feedback and learning, right? And so then you can see how that creates that separation based on those factors. And so, like after that, I went to a friend of mine and I was like, hey, I think I might have a racial blind spot. And I was like, like, this is what happened. I was like, can you tell me about this? So this friend of mine was like, yeah, absolutely. And she was like, yeah, this is a massive blind spot. This is like a systemic thing. And like, we grew up in a culture that normalized this particular way of humor and storytelling. And so I can see that, in your mind, you're like, well, I'm just like telling a story. And like, I don't see, like, I'm not excluding you. And of course you would be welcome here. And I don't understand how this is racist. And she's like, but it is. And I was like, wow, okay, I totally get it. And then I went back to the person, I like apologized, and then I publicly apologized to everyone. And I was like, hey, I learned something new about this. And, I didn't know this before. Right. And so it's like, I kind of had to correct afterwards, which I think is ultimately like, when we are accused, we do have to correct after the fact, rather than if it's approached differently. It was the first time I ever thought about this, at the time thinking, if this person had have approached me differently with this, I would have really appreciated that, and like, it's a valuable learning experience. And if that happened again now, I wouldn't be triggered by it. But at the time, I remember thinking, there's a really big opportunity here, like to teach people to approach things differently. But then it's also kind of like, when you've been a victim of racism and like, you've been a minority and you've been subjugated to like all these different things, it's kind of like, well, like you're going to be reacting from generations of trauma and like all of these things, right? So it's kind of like, yeah, also we're all trying our best. So like, let's not get upset, And then something happened a couple months after that where I was, again, sharing a story about an experience that I had in Jordan. I was talking about the people that live in Petra that have like lived there for 40,000 years. And I used the word gypsy, which I used because they were referring to themselves that way. And that was the word that they used. And so then I used it, and then someone was like extremely offended and was like, again, accused me of like something. And I was like, no. Like I was like, I'm just using the word that they used. And I was like, I'm not like trying to use, and they were like, no, you don't understand that. And I was like, well, this is definitely an opportunity to learn, but I like didn't intend it to mean that. And I'm really sorry. But this person was just like, was so mad at me that they just like offed. And I was like, it's really not the intention with which I was trying to use that word, like. And so interestingly enough, Brené Brown actually uses a very similar example where she used the word jibbed, like I was jibbed. And someone came up to her and they're like, I was a really big fan of your work until you used this word. And I've realized that, like you blah, blah, blah. And she was like, what? She was so confused and she was like crying. And I was like, yeah, I've had like a similar experience, where I was just like, I really fundamentally like believe that everyone belongs, and like I've experienced so much racism against myself in so many different communities, and so the idea of excluding others just feels so foreign to me. It's like really not an intentional thing. It's just like the use of language and like certain terms that are derogatory that you just may not have the awareness of, right? So it's like, yeah, if this person had have approached me and said, hey, I'm going to assume that you don't know that, this word is actually a derogatory word based on hurtful stereotypes, just letting you know that it is. Like, if you use that, people might be really offended. Or like, if you said this, people might be really offended. And so like what we want to do in certain situations is we want to give people the benefit of the doubt. And like for me, whenever someone has said something very racially slurring in my presence, I don't like throw intense accusations at them. I often don't even correct them. Half the time I do, but it just depends. But I think like something that's so valuable that I got out of this process of, I mean, my own experiences, but also reading this book, is give people an opportunity to learn. And I think like we want to create a culture where we all get to learn and grow together. And that's how we create a more inclusive, safe world for everyone, where it's like, So much of what we express is just so subconscious based on the system that we are learning in. And it's often like the system which is so deeply flawed. It's like, if I knew better, if we all knew better, we probably would be better. So think about it, like, it would be very rare that someone's actually just a cunt of a human being and is like really out to get you, you know? Like, we want to give people the benefit of the doubt. Like, why do we always immediately assume that someone is a bad person? Why wouldn't we assume that they're a good person and that maybe like they just don't know this one thing? And why don't we use that as an opportunity to be like, hey, I don't know if you know this or not, but this is actually quite hurtful. Like, hey, I don't know if you know this or not, but I was really, like, yeah, this is a hurtful thing, or this is a derogatory thing, or like this is actually, and even rather than using like very heated language, like that's racist, just be like, this is hurtful. No one wants to hurt anyone, like if people knew, then they would self-correct. So we cultivate culture of belonging with inclusive language by not accusing or assuming the worst, and instead of just like giving people an opportunity to learn. And I think having that communication framework is so powerful. And I'm not like excusing, behaviors, but I just think that like if we want to do better, we need to all learn how to do better, right? And it's just like, how do we do that? And it's like with these communication frameworks, they're so helpful. So that brings us to our next segment, which is like, when you are someone that is in the line of fire and you feel like you don't belong somewhere, and like maybe people are really critical of you, or like they're being kind of like verbally violent, or like there's just, it's like you are subjected to, like hate or bullying or harassment. Like, where is that line of you saying like, I belong here, versus being like, okay, this is unsafe and I don't need to tolerate this? Like, what a great question. Like, where is that line of being like, well, I belong everywhere? And it's like, okay, cool. Let's break that down. You don't ever have to tolerate any kind of harassment or dehumanization. Like, you don't have to tolerate criticism or bullying. You don't ever need to tolerate someone challenging your human rights. And so, it's like, okay, there's this internal safety check that needs to happen where we go, are my rights being violated? And what am I standing up for here? And then going, okay, cool, I'm going to lay down a boundary, or I'm going to assert a boundary. And if it's respected, great. And if not, I'm going to leave. In order to connect with other people, we need to feel vulnerable. We need to be able to get vulnerable with one another. We need to feel like transparent and human and messy and raw. We need to feel honest, right? We need to be honest with one another. And again, like those conversations are so vulnerable about the like, hey, I'm not sure if you know. It's like, it's so vulnerable to be able to do that, but we need to be able to do that. And think about how much more connected you're going to feel after that conversation. You're going to feel so much trust and so much safety and like relief, like this person gets to learn, you get to grow together, and you got to be a part of that evolution. Like, that's a really beautiful thing. Like, why wouldn't you want to be a part of that, But in order to feel vulnerable with someone, in order to get vulnerable with someone, we need to feel safe. We need to feel safe to do so, that they're going to receive it, right? They're going to be able to respond appropriately with maturity. So, we can't feel safe without boundaries. So we all need to be able to advocate for ourselves. We need to be able to be like, hey, this is the line of what I'm willing to tolerate, and I'm not willing to tolerate this. Like, I'm not going to tolerate abuse. I'm not going to tolerate violation of my rights. Like, that's not okay. And if you do this, then I'm going to leave, right? I'm going to remove myself from the situation. And that's the enforcement of that boundary. So in order to connect, we obviously need those firm boundaries to protect ourselves both physically and emotionally. Here's the beautiful thing about not fitting in. Like, you shape the world by being different. You shape it with your uniqueness and all of the things that you get to add to a community or a group or a culture. We always love and revere the melting pots, and they get to be that way by everyone contributing their differences. And that's what makes it fun and spicy and interesting. Like, don't silence yourself to fit in. your uniqueness, your differences are what make you special. It's what makes the whole environment incredibly special. I said earlier that I never felt like I belonged in Melbourne and that I ran away every chance I got. And my own solution to belonging for a very long time was to look for the place. And what I realized is that I wasn't looking for belonging. What I was looking for was culture fit, which is where the beliefs and the attitudes of a culture match mine. And, the thing that sparks these quests to find this, ethereal feeling, it's all of the unspoken, unresolved moments in childhood where we don't yet know how to advocate for ourselves and our authenticity, where we haven't yet learned those communication skills or those boundaries, and we're not reassured by others, whether family, friends, whatever. We don't have anyone intervening and stepping in, being like, you're allowed to be here, you're accepted, it's okay. All of those moments where we don't speak up, we don't fight for ourselves, our values, because we just don't know how to yet. No one else says it's okay. All of that creates a void, and that void is what ultimately sparks the quest to feel this sense of belonging. But so many of us are chasing our tails. The process of belonging is not about finding your tribe. It runs so much deeper than that. It's not even about finding the friends that feel like family, although that may help. It's not about finding the culture that shares your attitudes and beliefs. As long as we continue seeking those who accept us based on our beliefs and our ideologies, we're never going to feel like we really belong, because we're looking in the wrong direction. We're basing that feeling on the wrong fundamental thing. And so what I want you to ask yourself and to journal on is this: what would it feel like if I belonged to me? If I belonged to no one and nowhere and nothing else outside of myself, but just to me, what would that look like? What would I advocate for? What would I stand up and fight for? What are my values? What do I believe in? Ultimately, I think that it really is this quest of being like so clear on, through your deconditioning process, what have you injected as values versus like what are your true innate values, and being like, cool, this is like, this is fundamentally true for me. And then when you're so clear on those values and you're like really clear on who you are within yourself, and that becomes really integrated and unshakable, then you fight for that and you build the strength and the resilience to be like, this is who I am and this is what I believe in. And like, here's where I'm open to debate and here's where I'm open to learning and growth. And ultimately, like, I'm going to advocate for my right to belong in any social group. I'm going to advocate for my right to exist in this group of friends, in this society, in this culture, in this organization, because I don't need to agree with you on these certain things in order for me to belong here. I belong here because I'm human. And it's that shift in mindset from seeing it, that way, to seeing it as like, nah, I'm good with me. And so then we can truly grasp and hold that paradox of I belong nowhere, I belong everywhere, but I belong to me. And so to kind of bring this back to this larger thing of like my relationship with Australia and like this kind of country that I've come from and this place that I've grown up in, and this family that I've grown up in, what I'm really seeing is that ultimately, as long as I'm good with me and I don't base my belonging on this external thing, on the agreeance, then I can be in any subculture, I can be in any group, and I can be like, yeah, here's what I can add to the table if you're interested in that. You don't have to be interested in that, but like, I've got some quirks, I've got some weirdness, I've got some unique flavor, like you don't necessarily just want to exist in these echo chambers. You want to be able to go from place to place or from subculture to subculture, and you want to be able to hold all of it. You want to be able to hold all humanity. That's when you know that you're really interconnected. That's when you're really like existing as the one and the all, and that's like when you feel that sense of ease within yourself and wherever you are. because it's not based on this false sense, this false idea of the construct. You know, it's like, I think that in personal development realms, we have kind of arrived at this clarity of inquiry when it comes to love. And it's like, you know, you don't look for love outside of yourself. And it's like, well, you know, belonging is the same and the home thing is the same, right? But it's like, in order for you to do that, this is the process that you go through, where you are advocating for yourself, and you can see that it isn't about sharing the perspectives. I would love to know how this landed for you. It was such an interesting penny drop for me. You know, like, it wasn't this big explosion of like, whoa, I've just had this big breakthrough. It was really more of this like subtle, like, oh, yeah. It was like that. It was very subtle, but I felt it move like within me. And I was like, yeah. And, you know, I realized I kind of have actually feel like I've had this for like quite some time. And I feel like I've actually cultivated this skill over the last 5 years since I've left. This skill of being able to get firmer in my own backbone and be more resilient in my authenticity and being like, yeah, like, we can be different, and like, yeah, this is who I am. And so then upon coming back here, I've been able to sort of go, yeah, you know, like, I'm pretty different to a lot of people here. And that doesn't mean that like I can't be here. It just means like I know who I am. And no one's telling you that you can't be here, unless they are, in which case you set a boundary. So let me know, send me a message. I would love to know what breakthroughs or epiphanies or insights you've had. Big topic. I hope it landed. I can't wait to speak to you again and share more of this journey of the human experience. I hope you have a great day wherever you're tuning in from, and I'll see you in our next episode.